Hi guys, welcome back to another video. So I am going to be doing a watercolor painting session today, as I usually do like a traditional video on Monday, but this time I'm not going to be doing it in my sketchbook, so apologies if you're looking forward to a sketchbook session rather than a full-on painting. But one thing I've been saying like ever since last year, I think, is that I wanted to do more watercolor painting, and I feel like at the end of December, I actually started to paint a little bit more, and I've been getting more and more familiar with how I want to use hot press paper, I think. So I am using the Rubens hot press paper. I believe it's around 7 by 10 inches, and it is like a paper block. So it does have like glue or some kind of sealant all the way around the paper edges, except for the center part of the left side, so that you can cut away if you would like to peel the paper from the whole block, so you can use the next page. I think I'll show you guys a little bit later the other paintings that I have done using the Rubens for the most part. I'll show that at the very end so you guys can see kind of like the color payoff of the paper and stuff, and what I've done already with this particular paper block, because I don't think I've scrapped any of the paper that I've used. So yeah. So in terms of subject today as well as materials, I'll make sure to add little card things at the top so you guys know what material I'm using at the time, because I think I forget to show each thing to the camera. So yeah, I'll make sure to label it at the top. But today I wanted to paint Reimu. So Reimu Endou is a member of Nijisanji-en, and she's part of Arrtx. And I don't know if it's because like I've been digging around in my art supplies, but also like in the back of my brain, one thing I kind of really miss about painting with watercolor is being able to layer up in a certain way. And I feel like in the past, or like it's in the past, but like kind of more recently, and kind of why I stopped doing as much watercolor painting compared to how much I used to paint during my uni days versus like post uni days, if that makes sense. So I think if you guys are familiar with my watercolor journey, I basically picked up watercolor and started to watercolor in I think my third year, or like just before my third year. So like in between, I think it's like the summer of my, I'm remembering this wrong. So in my third year, I took painting class, and you could either had a choice between acrylics or oils. So basically in second year, the first semester you do acrylics, second semester you do oils. And I did not get along with using oils at all, and I had a kind of like a breakthrough for myself using acrylics, so I decided to use acrylics for my third year. And when I was doing my third year, I realized I really didn't like using acrylics, and I think my teacher could tell. So kind of like midway through, my professor was like, you know, is there any other medium we'd like to try out? And I decided to pick up watercolor, and I struggled with it because I switched halfway and I didn't really have any proper like teaching or anything like that, or just like having time to actually use watercolor and explore with it, which is something I highly recommend if you want to get into a medium. Just play around with the medium first, then do research, or do research and then experiment, but you have to have like hands-on. Like I don't think there's a way for you to use a material by just doing research and then going head first into using that medium. It's just like, don't expect anything good. I think like you'll gain more experience by being able to play around with the medium for the most part. But before I continue on, I was showing the sketch portion. So I did sketch with the Pilot Color Eno as usual, as kind of like my base, and then I started to darken up some lines and picking some lines with the Prismacolor Kohl Erase so we don't lose our lines when we start painting. But I'm going to be doing something a little bit different, and this is going to kind of tie into my switch into watercolor. So after I kind of like taught myself watercolor during the summer between third and fourth year, because in fourth year you kind of do more of like self-study, curating your own kind of artwork and theme, as well as you get your like solo studio kind of thing. So I wanted to fully go into just using watercolor, and one thing I saw, I don't remember which artist it was at the time, but they were using hydrous liquid watercolor from Dr. Martin, I think it's called, the brand, and I believe they have also like hydrous inks. But the watercolor that you guys saw me have in the little bottles is basically liquid watercolor. And the difference for how I specifically use it, and I'll link a video that I've used it in the past as well, because I actually went back to that video to reference for myself, which I'll get into another question I have for you guys in a little bit as well. So you can see that I decided to add some kind of line work to my painting, and usually you guys know that I don't really like doing line work because I feel like it's a little bit rigid. I feel like I'm coloring in a coloring book, as well as I'm not fond of my line work usually. And you can see like the lines that I did for the little flowers in the back, which I wanted to draw as like forget-me-nots, that I think Reimu likes these flowers and often is portrayed with these blue flowers, so I wanted to include them. And it kind of made me want to approach it similarly how I did my 17 Come To Me painting that I did way back then. I think it's in 2019, 2018, around that time. There's a speed paint of it, but like I said, I'll add it into the description so you guys can check it out. Because when I did the foliage, I actually did line work first, and these liquid watercolors are more or less, I would say 90 to 95% permanent. So because it's permanent, it's easier for me to layer up the colors in a certain way and be able to create like shadows and a little bit of depth in a different way without budging the previous lines underneath. So the difference from when I do this kind of process with if I just use normal watercolor, usually if I oversaturate the paper with water or if I go back and forth too much, you'll be reactivating the bottom paint or like your previous layers of paint, and you start to lift them up and they start to become less like sharp, and oftentimes you're rubbing out the entire like lines or shapes that you already painted, or your paint gets a little bit more muddy because you're now mixing the new paint with the old paint because you're reactivating it. But because this liquid watercolor doesn't really reactivate too much when it's on the paper, I don't recommend. So like if you did blue lines like I did and you add like yellow, or you just do plain water, you might get a little bit of pigment coming through. So usually I like to layer similar colors together if I'm doing this process. So for my 17 piece that I used to do, or I did back then, I did dark green lines, and then I built up from yellows to I think some greens, dark green, and I added blue for shadows around the edges. And it was easy for me to do that because I didn't have to worry about reactivating the paint. So that's what I did for Reimu's piece. I wanted to make sure that the forget-me-nots looked full, if that makes sense. Whenever I do like foliage, I have a hard time finding a balance between making things look too like individually drawn out, if that makes sense, or too faded. So I wanted a happy medium, and I wanted to do that by playing around with the values, and I thought it'd be easiest by doing it with the liquid hydrous Dr. P.H. Martin, whatever it's called, liquid watercolors, if that makes sense. I might look into getting a new set if I can't reactivate some of them. I have 2 bottles that are completely dried out just because it's been years since I've used them, but I think for the most part I can get away with not using those 2 bottles because I think it's like colors I'm not going to be using too much. I think it's an ultramarine, and it might be like a carmine red or something. There's like a different vibrant red and a blue and a purple that I could use to mix for the colors that I would need. But after I was kind of like 75% done the background, I decided to start painting Reimu. So I usually like to start with the skin, and then we can move on to her hair. And for the lighting, so in my brain, because I didn't do any preliminary sketches or just like rough drafts or anything like that, I kind of did the lighting as I went. All I knew is that I wanted the light to come from the top right going down onto the figure, but I didn't make it as intense as I would like it to. So if you know kind of, I guess it's like Reimu's lore and stuff, I feel like more darker themes would fit well with her visually as well as like thematically, and I would have liked to push more of the dark tones or just like push the contrast a little bit for this one, but once again I got a little bit chicken and I decided that I didn't want to. You can see me like attempt to add more shadows to the left side and then suddenly kind of go over another brush through and lighten it up again because I got a little bit scared. So usually if I'm doing like a more intense piece, I would like to plan out and map values out a little bit. I think I got a question recently that if I ever do like marker illustrations, pencil crayon illustrations, or like painting, do I plan out the lighting by shading with my pencil prior to doing anything else? And the answer is no. Usually I would have to do thumbnailing or just some other visual way to represent how I want to do the values. So usually studies is a good way. If you can, you could take a photo of your sketch and then do it digitally by adding like multiply layers or just painting on top. Thumbnailing I think is usually what I usually do, so that I can also plan out colors very roughly. I don't know why. I like planning things traditionally rather than digitally. Which brings me up to another question. I probably should have said this at the very beginning. Maybe I'll put it into the pinned comment and you guys can let me know. The idea of how I want to present these videos, I'm still very torn. So in the beginning, you guys would have saw me that I kind of did snippets of real time for the sketching process and I switched over to time-lapse mode. The thing is like my painting I think took about 4 to 5 hours, which is longer than my digital work to some extent, but also I personally find it more satisfying to seeing the whole piece come together in time-lapse mode when it's traditional art versus digital art. I think it's also because I actually don't know why I prefer it. It's just something about it that I like seeing the full process. Digital art, I don't know if it's just because I rather skip certain aspects of it just because maybe it's just my process I don't find very interesting. But for traditional, maybe it is a personal thing that I just want to keep the full footage so that later on if I ever get stuck or anything I can reference it. Because like for the 17 one that I did like a few years ago, I went back to see how I did the layering because I really wanted to see whether or not the bleeding was like going to be an issue, and it wasn't, so I felt a little bit more comfortable going straight in because like I said, I didn't plan this out. So if the blue part of the flowers didn't work out, I would have botched the whole piece pretty much. Also in the bottom left hand corner, I added some forget-me-nots down there, and I kind of tunnel visioned a little bit when I was like sketching out Reimu because I think I left it blank because it's supposed to be either I think the back of her veil or it's supposed to be just full on her hair. But when I was doing the line work and the kind of like the first few washes of the blue, I covered it in, but now it looks like her hair is a little bit like cut off. So I think it'll look okay at the very end because it just looks like some flowers are just laying on top of her, but it's definitely not supposed to be there for the most part. And something else that's a little bit different is that I used a bunch of different brushes this time for this piece. So I did take my time to switch between brushes. I used my, I think it's like Simply Simmons, I think it's what the bigger brush was called, to do some of the bigger washes of the blue areas. Then I'm using the Raphael Kolinsky brush, which is the brown one, and the black one for the most part for the majority of the painting for Reimu. And then I switched to the Arrtx travel sized brush for, I think I did it for the line work, and I'll do it for the line work as well after when I finish painting for the most part, or like painting all the shadows, the shapes, the hues and stuff. It's just like when I do the final step of adding the final lines, I decided that I wanted a brush that kept its point a little bit more, and the Arrtx travel size, like the blue, I think it's a number 8, keeps this point super well, though it can't handle holding a lot of water, so I thought it was perfect for doing the line work. So the reason why I said that the background is also only about like did I say like 75% done-ish? So I decided to add, I think, 2 more washes to it, as well as a little bit more shadows into some of the individual petals, and then we'll go back in with some gouache to add a little bit of white and yellow highlights to the center of some of them, so that they don't become too like just pure blue, but also just being able to pick a little bit more detail out of some of the flowers will just help with the depth a little bit. And I tried my best to incorporate blue into the entirety of Reimu as well, just because I don't want to introduce this like jarring amount of blue and not have any present on her. So I added some for petals here and there, added it into the bow and some of the black areas, as well as in her hair. So I did my best to kind of incorporate it everywhere, but the blue intensity that is in my watercolor set versus the liquid watercolors is a little bit different. I forgot to mention that the Dr. P.H. Martin liquid watercolors, they are much more vibrant because they have such a concentrated amount of pigment in their bottles compared to the pan watercolors or tube watercolors. So if you want something like high intensity, but something very workable, because I know some people get very scared of using inks, even though I find this one looks or like works very similarly to inks, like colored inks, because I believe this brand also makes colored inks for like this liquid format in the tube bottles with the little eyedropper at the top. Very similar, but these ones are watercolor, and I just find that they flow nicely, and sometimes ink doesn't flow as nicely or it flows a little bit differently compared to watercolor. I don't have too much experience using ink, so I won't say too much about it, but tangent. Right, I was supposed to talk about the video formats. So I personally like the time-lapse version unless I'm recording for like real-time full process session like I've done. I think I did for Millie's, as well as like previous ones I think I did of Yao Yao, Barbara, Child at some point, and Shengling, I think. But if I'm not, do you guys prefer these kinds of videos to be in time-lapse, or do you guys prefer real-time kind of like snippets? Because if that's the case, I'll try my best to kind of mix it up a little bit, but if not, I'll probably do a lot more of these larger paintings full session in time-lapse mode, because watercolor feels like such a slow, delicate process that when I do it in time-lapse mode, even though I know people would prefer some real time, probably because you like seeing these slow brush strokes when people paint or do line work, but I don't think the painting goes too fast when it's time-lapse like this. I know some people don't like the length of it, so maybe I'll try to shorten it a little bit more, or we'll see. Yeah, you guys can let me know what you guys prefer, and I'll do that for like future painting videos, because I would like to paint more. Like I said, I'm even considering doing more painting streams, maybe. We'll see, because traditional painting kind of scares me for real time. I don't know if it's because I can't put my full focus, so digital is easier, but I don't know, maybe it's also because like painting for people live is a little bit more intimidating versus digital, where it's like things are less permanent, I guess. But I think that's about it in terms of process. So you can see I'm taking my time doing the line work by matching the colors if I can, so like a lot of browns and a little bit more red tones near her face, and then any clothing article is a little bit darker, or trying to match the similar hue to each of those separate parts. And then any place that I feel like looks a little bit off, because usually when I do line work at the very end, line work tends to be a little bit darker whenever I do it, so it's a little bit easier for me to balance out some of the shadows by adding shadows after I do some of the line work. This paper is actually pretty okay with layering, so I didn't have too much of the line work kind of budging or lifting as I was working. Some other papers that I've used in the past would lift quite easily, so it makes it a little bit harder for you to add shadows like over top of a whole area. So yeah, I took a kneaded eraser to erase a little bit of like the red pencil that you could see through if it wasn't covered by paint already, because water in the paint would have sealed in the pencil. and I decided to pick out some lighter colors of gouache to do some of the highlights. So on her right eye, I accidentally kind of painted over the highlight, so I wanted to make it a little bit brighter, and I added to the left one so that we could also make it brighter as well, so they kind of match. And then I added some to her collar so that we can kind of bring out the detail, because I already had plans of using gouache from the very beginning, so I wanted to just cover in her collar so we can have an even color, and then we can add in the chain at the very end. And then you guys can see I'm adding a little bit of dots into some of the flowers, only where the shadow isn't like super dark, so that the highlights kind of make sense. And then I added some white to some of the other flowers, and then usually I would add like little strands of hair, but I thought maybe I didn't need to do it this time, just because a lot of her clothing is on the lighter side for the most part, where her hair is, so I didn't want it to be too out of place. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I don't like consider myself a person who uses watercolor in a very like purist way, elitist way. I know some people are like, don't use gouache, don't use pencil crayon on top to embellish your pieces, because that's not considered a watercolor piece, it's considered a mixed media. But I still consider it as a watercolor piece, so that's what I'm gonna call it, because the majority is done in watercolor. And I think that's about it. I'll show you guys some close-ups, and yeah, hope you guys enjoyed today's session, as well as I think this is the first video of the new year, so happy new year. Even though this video might be, yeah, it's the day after new year I think when this video will go up. But I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!